Hello everyone and welcome to this new lecture. Today we're going to talk about relative pronouns and relative clauses, which is something that is very frequent in modern languages, and so you will find that a lot in Latin too. We have already talked about it in class, but this is going to be a sort of comprehensive lecture about all the features of a relative pronoun. So let's start with the question, what is a relative pronoun? So a relative pronoun is basically a small word that introduces a subordinate clause and is always referred to a noun which is called antecedent. In Latin, antecedere means to come before, and so this means that the antecedent is the noun that comes immediately before the relative pronoun. So it is a pronoun because it links two sentences and avoids the repetition of the same word. As we have pointed out in class, a pronoun is something that substitutes a noun. And you can see that in this example. I like Mark. Mark is my friend. So here I can avoid the repetition of the word Mark by using a relative pronoun. And so I like Mark, who is my friend. So in other words, the relative pronoun links the two sentences and puts them into a relation. And that is why it is called relative. The antecedent is of course the noun which the relative refers to. And in our example, the antecedent is Mark. In English, the relative pronouns are that, which, who, whose, and whom. In Latin, the relative pronouns are qui, quae, quod, and they have a full declension, which needs to be memorized. So this is the declension of qui, quae, quod. I'm just going to read it aloud. Qui, quae, quod, cuius, 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 cui, 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 quem, quam, quod, quo, qua, quo. Plural. Qui, quae, quae, quorum, quarum, quorum, quibus, 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 quos, quas, quae, quibus, quibus, quibus. So, the endings are not very difficult to memorize because they are pretty much similar to those of demonstrative pronouns, and this is pretty much of help. The only exception is the dative or and ablative plural, which takes the ibus ending, which is typical of the third declension. Another thing is that the English translation of singular and plural are the same, because English does not have gender and number for relative pronouns. And so, for example, we will translate qui and quae with who, quod with which, cuius and cuius, masculine and feminine, with whose, cuius neuter with of which, cui, cui, masculine and feminine, to whom, cui neuter to which, quem, quam, masculine and feminine, whom, quod, neuter, which, and then the ablative quo, qua, because of whom, quo, neuter, because of which. So it is very difficult to find the ablative of the relative pronoun alone, and is usually found in prepositions. And about that is the thing that when you find an ablative of accompaniment with the relative pronoun, the preposition cum is attached after the word. So you will not find cum quo, but you will find quocum, quacum, and quibuscum for the plural. This is pretty much similar to the personal pronouns. You do not find, for example, cum vobis to say with you all, but you find vobiscum. So this is something that we have already encountered in the past. So let's see how the relative clause normally works. So the relative clause is of course the subordinate clause introduced by the relative pronoun. And the relative pronoun agrees in gender and number with the antecedent, but the case depends on the syntax of the subordinate clause. So it is not like the adjective, because the adjective, if you remember, agrees in gender, number and case to the noun that it refers to. For the relative pronoun, it's different, because it agrees in gender and number, but for the case, we have to be careful and look at the syntax of the sentence. So in this first example, I put an antecedent and a relative pronoun that agree in case, but this is just a coincidence. So, habeo tres filhos, quos similiter amo. So I have 3 sons, which I love in the same way. In this case, filios and quos are both accusatives, because they function as direct objects of the main clause and the relative clause respectively. In other words, filios is the direct object of habeo, and quos is the direct object of amo. But in the second example, things are different, because I say vidi Caesarem qui Romam redibat. I saw Caesar, who was coming back to Rome. So in this case, we see that Caesarem and qui are in 2 different cases, because Caesarem is an accusative, and it is an accusative because it is the direct object of vidi, I saw whom? Caesar. And qui, however, becomes the subject of the relative clause. In other words, bi qui is the subject of redibat, and so it needs to be in the nominative case. So this is how a relative clause and a relative pronoun normally work, but we also have some special features of the relative pronouns, some special constructions that the Latin uses, and we also find them in modern. Some of them are also found in modern languages. So the first one is the so-called generic antecedent. So sometimes in everyday language, it happens that we couple a pronoun, which can be demonstrative or personal, or a noun, with a relative pronoun. And in this way, we create expressions such as he who, those who, the thing which, the man who, the person who. And so when you find such expressions in Latin, it can happen that the antecedent, that is to say the first element, is omitted. This is why the generic antecedent is sometimes called also omission of the antecedent. Of course, this omission of the antecedent is impossible or doesn't happen in modern languages. But one has to be careful because the omission can happen only if the antecedent and the relative pronoun are in the same case. Otherwise, it is necessary to express both elements. So I put here an example of the omission of an antecedent. So, qui honores amant, ambitiosi sunt. So, those who love honors are ambitious. So, as you can see, in English you need to express both the antecedent and the relative pronoun, those who. So if I were to translate those who literally in Latin, it would be I qui. I, those, qui, who. But since they are both nominative, in Latin the antecedent is perceived as superfluous. And this is why it gets eliminated. And so you do not say I qui honores amant, but simply qui honores amant. So the concept here is that the I is kind of already contained in the qui. So the relative pronoun in the nominative plural already contains the antecedent, if they are in the same case, of course. In the second example, there is a case in which antecedent and relative pronoun are in a different case, and therefore both of them need to be expressed. Vidi eos qui oppidum obsidebant. I saw those who were besieging the city. One could also translate, I saw the men who were besieging the city. But since eos is accusative and qui is nominative plural, they need to be expressed. Like the antecedent cannot be omitted. Otherwise, it would not be clear and also grammatically incorrect. The second construction is a very simple one. It's the connective relative. So in poor words, the connective relative is simply a relative pronoun right at the beginning of the sentence, after a strong pause, like for example a full stop or a semicolon. and it generally refers to an element of the previous sentence, which could be a noun or a concept. So whenever you find a relative pronoun at the beginning of the sentence after a strong pause, 100% connective relative. So it is fairly easy to recognize. So the connective relative should be translated as a personal or demonstrative pronoun. And before it, you can also add the conjunction and. But it's optional, I mean, it's up to you. It depends on a stylistic choice. So here is an example. Caesar et Crassus consules facti sunt, qui multa bella gesserunt. So Caesar and Crassus were elected consuls, full stop, and they waged many wars. So here, for example, I think that the end can be omitted, because otherwise, I don't know, it doesn't sound too beautiful to me in English. So in this case, as you can see, the connective relative is qui, because it comes just right at the beginning of the second sentence after a full stop. So the connective relative is a quite frequent construction in Latin, but as you can see, it is very easy to recognize and translate. So it is very difficult to go wrong. The last construction, which has this unnecessarily long name in your grammar book, so the placement of the antecedent in and after the relative clause, it is actually a very simple concept. So generally, when a relative clause is expressed, the natural word order of a sentence would be putting the main clause first and then the relative clause. So here I put as an example, I don't like those who tell lies. But I could list like endless other examples. So for example, I don't like the book that you gave me, I lost the match that I played yesterday, etc, etc. The placement of the antecedent in and after the relative clause, it is nothing but just the reversal of this order. So the relative clause comes first and then comes the main clause. So as you can see, it is an extremely simple concept. And that is why, instead of using this long name, which I think that complicate things more, I think that it is appropriate for you to call it just anticipation of the relative clause. The only thing that you have to be careful about is that sometimes, not always, the antecedent of the relative pronoun can be present in the main clause. So for example, in the second instance, those who said that are liars. Let's see how it works in Latin. So as you can see, you have the relative clause first and then the main clause. Qui hoc dixerunt, I mendaces sunt. So literally, this would be those who said that, these people are liars. But you can simply translate those who said that are liars. And also, sometimes you will not find the antecedent. So if you say, qui hoc dixerunt, mendaces sunt, it is perfectly okay. So in Italian grammars, we call it prolepsis, which simply means anticipation. Prolepsis is a Greek word of the relative. And that is why I think that it's just easier to call it anticipation of the relative clause, without complicating things too much. Okay, this is all I had to say. Of course, these are not like super simple concepts, so I think that the key in order to master the relative pronoun is just to practice and translate many sentences with it. But it's very frequent, so you will find it many times during your experience. Thank you for listening, and I will see you tomorrow in class.